Well, now it's the US president who appears to have folded. Trump last night extended the Iran ceasefire indefinitely. The bombing will stop, quote, until such time as the Iranians have agreed on their proposal. And to be clear, anybody who's against this war or any war should be glad about that. The problem for the president is that he has very little to show for the lost lives and the $60 billion impact on the US economy. Iran attacked 3 ships in the Hormuz Strait today. The US blockade of Iranian ships continues. And what all of this means in practice is that gas prices are at the highest point in years, and inflation is now higher than before Trump returned to office.
So Piers Morgan just laid out exactly why Trump's Iran war has become an unmitigated disaster, and he's absolutely right. After 7 weeks of bombing, $60 billion in economic damage, and mounting casualties, Iran has effectively called Trump's bluff by controlling global oil supplies. This analysis cuts through the noise.
We can argue about the justification for war and about what, if anything, has been achieved. But the fact is the president's position is weakened by the fact he clearly wants out of this. He's betting that Iran won't be able to suffer the prolonged financial pain of a US blockade. They're betting that they can tough it out for longer than a president who needs an off-ramp. And as long as they can turn off 1/5 of the world's oil supply like a bathroom tap, they're probably right. Iran said today that the ceasefire means nothing and is probably the pretext for a surprise attack. The most chilling fact is that they don't seem to care if it is. Iran's leaders are clearly prepared for their country to take a beating. They're clearly in no danger of being removed, and they clearly don't care much about the lives of their own people. In Trump terms, that means they're holding quite a lot of cards.
This is precisely why Iran's strategy is working. They control 20% of global oil through Hormuz. That's more leverage than all of America's aircraft carriers combined. Trump's conventional military dominance means nothing when Iran can crash the global economy with a few speedboats and sea mines.
Well, I think it's a war of choice. So a war of choice I'd like to end as quickly as possible. I'd like to get our soldiers out of harm's way. I'd like to remove the onerous changes that have come to our economy because of this war. And so the sooner the better for me. But I think it's important to know that if you want to stop a war, it's important to know how your enemy reacts. So, for example, we have completely defeated them in every military aspect of a war. They have no control of the air, no control of the seas, and really we can do as we wish with our bombing campaign. But people have to look back in history and see, well, what will people do in that kind of situation?
The historical parallel here is devastating. This mirrors Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Superior American firepower defeated every enemy militarily, but asymmetric warfare and economic pressure forced retreat every time. Iran studied these conflicts for decades and learned exactly how to exploit America's weaknesses.
So when you come to a diplomatic solution, you can continue to berate your enemy, you continue to belittle them, you can offer that you will obliterate their civilization or destroy their religion or mock their religion, but that's not a good way to actually get them to come to a diplomatic end to the war. And it's unlikely it'll be an unconditional surrender like the Japanese did after 2 atomic weapons. I think unconditional surrender is really off the table. But if there's stuff we still want, which would actually be good, like let's say they gave up their enriched uranium, that'd be a good result to a negotiation. But they're probably not going to do that just because of the military defeat. They're probably going to want something in return. So then you get to an actual negotiation. They're going to want some of their money freed up that's been frozen by the banking system.
Exactly right. Trump's obliterate their civilization rhetoric has made any face-saving negotiation impossible for Iranian leaders. They literally cannot agree to uranium handover without appearing to capitulate to threats. Trump painted both sides into a corner with his bombastic approach.
The question of the enriched uranium seems pretty crucial to all this, because for Donald Trump to have any kind of off-ramp now, which looks like a victory, he would have to persuade the American people that his now declared main mission, which was to stop Iran developing a nuclear weapon, had been achieved. The only way to, I think, do that convincingly is to actually have the enriched uranium handed over or destroyed, and to be provably destroyed. But if you're the Iranians, I'm not sure there's any real incentive to do that. And they can now use the Strait of Hormuz and, of course, their highly effective attacks on their Gulf state neighbors. They can do that anytime they'd like to put more pressure back on Donald Trump, who is facing already a lot of economic and political pressure himself the longer this goes on. So I just don't understand how that happens, how the enriched uranium gets, I don't think they're going to surrender it. And how does America or the Israelis as well, how do they get their hands on it without committing huge numbers of ground forces?
This perfectly captures Trump's impossible position. He promised to denuclearize Iran, but gave himself no achievable pathway. Current polling shows only 38% support for ground invasion, politically suicidal. He's trapped between unrealistic promises and harsh realities.
I would probably start out with a compliment before I tried to ask you for something. And that's the way negotiations work. It has to be on a more, I can't complain about your tie, you don't have a tie on, but it would have to be more of a conciliatory sort of conversation. And that's where we should be. And that doesn't involve words like ending the civilization, obliterating a people, bombing you back into the Stone Age. We kind of already have done that, and we've shown we have the might to do it. I don't think we have to brag about it anymore. At this point, we're in the diplomatic phase, and that really involves understanding that the leadership who's going to negotiate with you potentially has problems at home if they look too weak in the negotiations.
The diplomatic malpractice here is staggering. In Middle Eastern negotiations, allowing your counterpart to save face is diplomacy 101. Trump's continued threats make any Iranian leader who negotiates look like a traitor to their own people, guaranteeing failure.
President Trump, having campaigned so vociferously that he would not take America into these pointless, expensive wars, particularly in the Middle East, then takes America into the biggest potential war in the Middle East, which is with Iran. You know, a country of 90 million people, and people are scratching their heads going, how does that square with America first? And when you see that the polling shows that most Americans don't agree with this war. 1 in 4 Republicans don't agree with this war. Most Americans would like the president to get on with focusing, as you've just said, on domestic issues. They're scratching their heads going, why did he do this? And it looks to me, I may be proven wrong, I hope I am, but it looks to me like the president wants to get out of this now, but can't see an easy way to do that doesn't look like pulling out and surrendering.
The betrayal of Trump's base is undeniable. He campaigned relentlessly on ending Middle East wars, then launched the biggest potential conflict in the region's history. Even Tucker Carlson publicly apologized for supporting this war. That's how badly Trump miscalculated his own coalition.
Right. Piers, I agree with your framing, except for one small detail. It's all the same war. The Strait of Hormuz, the attack on our Gulf allies by the Iranians, the conventional attacks by the U.S. and Israel and Iran, it's all the same conflict. They're just different tools being used by different actors in that same conflict, and of course they're all related. And now we're almost 2 months into this thing, and what do we know for sure? Well, we know a couple of things. We know that the Trump administration's theory of the case, which is that this would be a short war, regime change, a Venezuela type agreement with whoever was left standing, was wrong. They had for whatever reason, either they were misled or misled themselves, got into this with completely wrong expectations about how the Iranians would react, what their capabilities would be. And the way that we know this is because President Trump says it all the time. He's admitted on several occasions. He was shocked that the Iranians would close the strait. He was shocked that they would attack our Gulf allies. Now, one could say that if he hadn't taken all of the people in the U.S. government with any expertise in Iran or negotiations out of the loop, that he might have been more aware of that, but that's a separate story. But to get to your question directly, where we are is nowhere. We're at a stalemate.
Iran's playbook was entirely predictable. They've published military doctrine about Hormuz closure for 20 years. Trump's team either ignored basic intelligence or were willfully blind. This strategic surprise mirrors the WMD intelligence failures before Iraq.
I mean, you're quoting poly market. I mean, the corruption in the poly market, not to mention the futures market, is unprecedented. And in that kind of a crazy situation, a delicate, agreement with the Iranians over serious issues that require a lot of nuance and a lot of hard negotiating, basically impossible. Both because of the chaos on their side, which is real, and the chaos on the U.S. side, which is real and obvious. So that's a really bad situation. In any country you go to, any diplomat you talk to in any part of the world will tell you the same thing, that the entire world is suffering because of the craziness of the Trump team and the intransigence of the Iranians. It's not that one is blamed or the other is blamed. They both have a responsibility for getting into this mess, and nobody has a plan for getting out. So I think this is going to be, at best, a medium-boil conflict for the foreseeable future, well into the summer, and at worst, a return to major combat operations that will cost American and Iranian lives especially.
The chaos described here is undermining decades of American diplomatic credibility. Trump's threats against power grids violate Geneva Conventions, actual war crimes. His erratic Truth Social posts make serious negotiation impossible while markets manipulate global suffering.
I'm very concerned. Look, the number one thing that people say everywhere is they're angry about the cost of goods. That is what I hear everywhere. I got three boys. Every time I go through the Chick-fil-A here in Nashville, where I live, it's over $50. Things cost way more than they should. I think it's probably something that everybody on this panel can agree with. And there's anger. And there's anger at everyone in power as a result, because, again, it just comes back to everything costs more. And so when gas, which was actually one of the things that would become more affordable, was under $3 a gallon, people felt better. Now that it's over $4, people get angry. Here's what I would say, Piers. President Trump is not actually making short-term calculations here. I believe really in his heart, President Trump has been angry at Iran for 40 years over the way that this government has treated our country. And I think that he sees in the 1990s what happened with
Gas prices have jumped from $2.90 to $4.30 since this war began. That's a 48% increase hitting every American family. The Hormuz closure affects global supply chains, driving inflation that's now higher than when Trump took office. Economic pain is mounting.
It's not Afghanistan. And for what? I think President Trump wants the nuclear dust, as he calls it, in the possession of the United States to prove, unlike the war with Iraq that George W. Bush led us all astray in, this is one where there were weapons of mass destruction, and we went and we seized them. Now, that is a cinematic ending for a president who has a cinematic scope of how stories like these should go. I think that's ultimately the resolution. And here, let me throw a little wrinkle in, Piers. I think there's an element of the Iranian leadership right now that might be willing to have that happen, but cannot say it publicly, because if they do, they're going to get killed. So how do we somehow wink, nudge agreement, maybe from people in control of Iran that want to be in power, but know if they're seen as facilitating this sort of act, they're going to get killed. They're going to end up like Gaddafi.
The psychological analysis here is spot on. Trump desperately wants to vindicate the Iraq War by finding real WMDs this time. But the Gaddafi comparison proves exactly why Iranian leaders will never cooperate. They've seen what happens to Middle Eastern leaders who surrender.
Second, I predict that, no, Trump will not be foolish enough to do a full land invasion of Iran, because that's a crazy thing to do. Third, I predict that this will be a stalemate that will go on for a long time, and that will crush not only the U.S. economy, every economy in the world, Piers. There's the Koreans, the Japanese, they're all paying 30% more for energy. European jet fuel is about, this is a disaster, not just for America, but for the world. And I predict that Trump doesn't have a clear way out. And the only way out, which is actual serious negotiations, he doesn't seem to be willing to do in any sustained way. And that's not a happy prediction, but it's also not based on sort of any corrupt prediction markets, and it's not based on any interest in trying to spin this as some sort of, best effort to get at a hard problem. It's not. It's a really incompetent, really misguided effort to get at a hard problem, and that hard problem is likely to persist.
The global impact is catastrophic. Japan and South Korea paying 30% more for energy, European economies staggering under fuel costs. America's closest allies are suffering for Trump's miscalculation, and his refusal to negotiate seriously makes this permanent economic damage.
And your reaction to the English-born Home Secretary of my country, Shabana Mahmood, who's a diligent, hard-working, intelligent, decent person born in Birmingham in the Midlands of my country. Your reaction to her, calling her a dirty Pakistani Muslim, was one of the most disgusting things I've seen or heard in a very long time. And it showed you for what you are. You are a disgusting, Islamophobic bigot that hates 2 billion people on this planet simply because of...
This bigotry is exactly why diplomatic solutions remain impossible. When Trump's base views Muslims as inherent enemies, any negotiation with Iran appears as surrender to religious warfare. The Islamophobic rhetoric makes the rational compromise needed for peace politically toxic.